Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this policy exchange session on catalysing action on climate change. For those who don't know me, my name is James Murray. I'm the editor of Business Green. For those of you who don't know Business Green, we're a news and analysis website for the green economy, for want of a better word. As we said today, we're here to talk about climate change and the centre-right. And as I imagine pretty much everyone here looking around would agree, this is a hugely important topic. It's a hugely important topic for the centre-right, obviously, not least because as climate change impacts continue to gather and as the seriousness of the environmental challenges we face in terms of energy security and resource scarcity become ever more pronounced, any political movement that doesn't have a coherent narrative and response to those risks, at least risks becoming alienated from voters. I mean, there's no two ways about that. You are facing up to that risk. It's also important for everyone because obviously if there isn't a political consensus, if there isn't agreement between the centre-right and the centre-left on the need to respond to climate change, responding to climate change becomes extremely difficult. As I say, I write about the business world, and businesses will find it extremely difficult to invest, react to any degree of policy certainty if they think each election could bring a fundamental change to the way we respond to climate change. They accept there will be some change, of course there will, and that's good for democracy, but if suddenly we move to a position where there is no response and no narrative, then businesses will find it very, very difficult to invest with any confidence in the green transition that is necessary. And it's clear that the centre-right does have numerous challenges with climate change that it faces. While it's not in any way true that everyone on the right of British life is climate sceptic, it is certainly true that 99% of people who are climate sceptic are on the right of British life. And that means there is this vision of the right being slightly hostile to climate science, hostile to the green agenda, which is a slightly bizarre position when you think that many people on the centre-right are fully committed to building greener economies, looking at more sustainable ways of living, improving our local environments. Many of these things are essentially centre-right and right-wing tropes. Energy security, another one, national security also. There are lots of things that could play into a centre-right narrative on climate change. And in contrast, the left, you might not agree with their prescriptions for tackling climate change, but they do have a coherent sort of worldview on how to do it around taxation, regulation, industrial strategy and intervention. As I say, you might not think these are the best ways of doing things, but there is a coherence there that we don't always see on the centre-right arguments around climate change. So that's it from me in terms of the introduction to this bit of background to sort of why this was brought together to discuss this key issue. We've brought together a fantastic panel of people who really are leading thinking in the UK on this agenda. From my left, your right, yes, right to left. We have Dr. Adam Corner from COIN, who will be presenting the results of the major new study into the narratives that we need to build on the centre-right to engage more clearly with climate change, and I would thoroughly recommend it to you. We then have Zac Goldsmith, a Conservative MP for Richmond, and of course one of the UK's most vocal environmental campaigners. Also, Claire Jacobson, who's the Executive Director of the Conservative Environment Network, and last but not least, Guy Newey, who's Head of Environment, Energy Policy Exchange, who are kindly hosting today's event. So that's it from me, so without further ado, first up we have Dr. Adam Corner, who's going to present the results of COIN's recent study into centre-right and climate change.
Great, thanks very much, James, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here today launching COIN's latest report, A New Conversation with the Centre-Right about Climate Change. And the central argument of the report is a really simple one. There's no inherent contradiction between climate change and the values of the centre-right, but there's a vacuum where a coherent and a compelling narrative on climate change should be. And that's bad news, not just for the centre-right, but for everyone. So, following a thorough review of the evidence base on climate change communication and a roundtable discussion, a kind of an expert focus group with people who are experts on communicating about climate change to centre-right audiences, we put together a report, and the report identifies 4 narratives for more effectively engaging citizens with centre-right views on climate change, to bring climate change, in the words of one participant in the roundtable meeting, out of its left-wing ghetto and into the mainstream. So the first narrative we call localism, and this is essentially just the idea that at the heart of a centre-right philosophy is a love for our green and pleasant land. So to the extent that climate change poses new dangers, new threats to the green and pleasant land around us, it ought to be something that Conservatives care about when framed in this way. The second narrative asks how energy security can be used to illustrate the idea that decarbonising is actually a sensible, a practical, a conservative, a cautious, risk-averse step to take in the face of climate change, a way of ensuring ourselves against other risks in the future, greater risks in the future. The third narrative builds on some of James's writing and work, which we call new environmentalism. This paradigm argues that climate change is too important for hippies and lefties. It should be the bold decision makers, business people, hard-headed folk who can lead and take action on climate change. And the final narrative we call the good life. And this is the idea that, again, a core part of centre-right philosophy is the idea that life's not just about making as much money as possible, quality of life is important, well-being, and to the extent that a more sustainable future is also one that doesn't threaten the health, the well-being of people's local communities. That's another frame that ought to be a good way of communicating people with centre-right views on climate change. But I thought that rather than explain in detail these narratives, I'd try and show you them in action. So if you indulge me in just a spot of speech making, honestly, I thought I'd pose the question, what if speeches on climate change to the centre-right sounded something like this? It's not an audition. The British people have a deep love for the countryside and our country's heritage. Many of us live and work in it right now, enjoy its benefits and understand that we're its stewards. Many more of us live in cities, but these should be clean and safe, not filled with congestion and pollution. And that means taking sensible, practical steps to deal with the risks posed by climate change, such as the flooding that devastated hundreds of people's homes last November. And over the years, the great British people have cleaned up our rivers, banished smog from our cities and protected our forests. Now we must move away from dirty and polluting sources of energy and towards energy technologies that will bring benefits for us all. We must work together to preserve the natural wealth that we have received from our parents and pass the same privileges on to our children and grandchildren. We're all lucky enough to have benefited from the fruits of the Industrial Revolution, but now it's time for a second Industrial Revolution, one based on clean local energy and one that will employ a new generation of engineers, labourers, technicians, scientists and trade people. Sustainable, secure jobs and sustainable, secure energy. So we have choices, but we must be honest about what these choices are. Fossil fuels like coal and oil are still available to us, but they cause climate change, damaging our health, our countryside and our local communities. We don't need to wait for the world to agree on what to do. We can start making sensible, practical choices now to protect our future. So business as usual may be unsustainable, but sustainable businesses are a vital part of the economy and are standing strong despite these times of austerity. Climate change needs strong leaders, bold decision makers, and the innovation and ingenuity that our country does so well. The climate's already beginning to change. If we want to stay in control of that change, to conserve our future, we must act now. I'm not standing for office anywhere anytime soon. But this speech could have been given by a politician from any of the major parties. It could have been given by a campaigner. It could have been given by a community leader. It could have been given by a CEO. Because it's not just in the centre-right's interest to have a coherent narrative on climate change. It's in everyone's interest that the centre-right has some degree of ownership over, is part of the conversation on climate change. There's no progress forward without at least some level of buy-in from the different political perspectives. And the problem is that climate change communication has to a large part traditionally been infused with the language, the ideas, the frames, the narratives of the left. And our argument in this report is that scepticism about climate change on the centre-right is greater not because of underlying doubt about the science or a lack of information about the facts, but because the answers to climate change haven't sounded like the kinds of things that people with centre-right views ought to care about and should support. So our report began by asking the experts, people who know about centre-right citizens and who've got experience of talking to this group about climate change, so my fellow panellists, Zac and Guy and our chair James as well. We asked them for their recommendations. What were the key barriers and opportunities to more effectively communicating with the centre-right about climate change? We then went and conducted a thorough review of the academic but also policy, civil society reports and evidence. What do we know about how to communicate with this group of people? And this is, I guess, one of the things that COIN specialises in, taking academic research, applying it to practical questions and challenges like this, sort of bridging the gap between research and practice. And the report talks a lot about values, and that's because there's a good few decades now of social psychological research that's asked, what are people's values? How do different values that people hold cluster together? This is research that's been done in over 60 countries, thousands of people over several decades. And there's a certain cluster of values, things like an appreciation of natural beauty, a sense of civic responsibility, concern for the welfare of other people, that tend to cluster together. You can think of these as, I guess, we values, things that transcend the self. And we know from lots and lots of empirical research that these values predict positive engagement with climate change, with other environmental risks as well. Then there are things you could think of as me values, so things like materialism, desire for authority over other people. These values are negatively associated with concern about climate change, support for mitigating climate change. Now, this doesn't mean that they're wrong or they're bad, and all of us, whether we're left or right, we have a range of values. We all covet some kind of material possession. We all have some degree of concern for the welfare of others that we care about. But what it does mean is that as you activate one of these clusters of values, the other is suppressed. So something we talk about a lot in this report is the need to not only identify where centre-right values are, but to also think about these we values and building a bridge between the values of the centre-right and the values of what you might call a more sustainable society. So I think you've all got a 2-page summary of the report in your seats. I hope that you'll go and take a look at the full report. And we stand by the rhetoric of the title. At COIN, we want to have a new conversation about climate change, not just with the centre-right, but with the wide range of other groups that also haven't had a stake in this issue so far and should have. So I guess we want to turn the debate on climate change scepticism upside down. It's not about trying to convince people they're wrong. It's trying to understand what motivates scepticism about climate change in the first place and start from there, work backwards from the values to the facts on the ground. So I think it's in everyone's interest, left or right, to have a new conversation about climate change with the centre-right, and I hope that today will be the start of that conversation. Thank you very much.
Are you sure it's not a rehearsal? There are possibly some by-elections coming up. We don't know. This could be fairly soon. I would seriously recommend the report to you. Like most journalists, I do things last minute, and as a result was reading it this morning. And half an hour read, it does sum up a lot of those arguments very, very succinctly. Next up, we have Zac Goldsmith, MP.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really good stuff, this report. Pleased to be here. Thank you. I'm going to be brief, because I think the idea is to have a discussion. Interesting to know how many people here see themselves as belonging to the green centre-right. I bet there aren't that many. I'm probably the only one. Is that right? Other than Claire. I won't ask you to put your hands up. That's probably not something that most people are willing to do. It's a terrible admission to make. But I think that in it and of itself probably explains better than anything else why this report, why this initiative, why this event, and the process that it forms part of is just so important. It is crucial. James said in his introduction, you can have a left-wing approach to dealing with the environment, you can have a right-wing approach, you can have a centrist approach, but if you are a serious political party and you don't have an approach to dealing with these issues, you can't be taken seriously as a party. You don't deserve to be elected. You don't deserve to be in any form of government. So I think it really, really is crucial. If I had to do if I had to do a template speech on centre-right approach to green issues, I don't think I could do better. Not wanting to be offensive to you, you just delivered a beautiful one, but I don't think I could do better than the speech that was delivered in 2008 by David Cameron, or 2007 by George Osborne. I thought at the time, and I recently sent David Cameron's speech back to him, I said, you might want to read this, it's good stuff. I think it was one of the most impressive speeches I've heard by a serious figure in a serious political party, and it wasn't just climate change, it's covered the whole spectrum. And in a couple of minutes, I just want to read you a couple of sections, not this second, but it seemed so right to me at the time. I had just signed up as a Conservative Party candidate. I wasn't selected for the seat that I grew up in, but I was about to be. And a lot of my friends from the green world thought I'd just gone completely mad. What the hell was I doing signing up to the Conservative Party? And I couldn't understand that, because on a very basic level, conservatism and environmentalism ought to go absolutely hand in hand. Stewardship, looking out for future generations, living within ecological means, appreciation for scale issues, countryside, food security. These are absolutely core, staple Tory or Conservative values. And I've always taken the view that if you are a Conservative who is not also motivated by a regard for the environment, for future generations, then you can't really consider yourself to be a Conservative at all, not a proper one. Unfortunately, that does put me in a bit of a minority in the party, but I remember my uncle, who passed away recently, who was a very prominent Green. He had a picture on his wall, and it was of all these French soldiers marching down the road. And one of the mothers turned to her neighbours and said, "You see, my Jean-Paul is the only one marching in step." And in a sense, I sometimes feel like that. But I am the true Conservative because I'm an environmentalist, not in spite of my environmentalism. But it goes back a long way. There is a long and distinguished history of Conservative engagement with this issue. And you can talk to some of the icons of the Conservative Party. Margaret Thatcher. I'm sure many of you will have read or at least just heard about her no-regret speech, one of the great speeches by a political leader on these issues. She was the first political leader, I think we're probably about to be corrected, who put climate change right to the top of the agenda. She's credited with having delivered the Montreal Protocol. It was already there, and it would have happened without her. But I think most people accept that it would have been fairly meaningless without her involvement. She said, if we're going to do it, let's do it right. She took personal charge. And as a result, it was probably the best example of an international approach to dealing with an environmental problem that actually worked. You go back, Robert Peel and the Mines Act, the Factory Act, a whole long list of these things. The Disraeli, the Public Health Act, the Pure Food and Drugs Act, his Artisans' Dwellings Act, which was part of the slum clearance and town planning process. Anthony Eden, the Clean Air Act, in response to the smogs which were making life impossible in London at the time. You've got Margaret Thatcher, more recently, I mentioned the Montreal Protocol, the Wildlife and Countryside Act, the Environmental Protection Act, and so on. There are so many examples of where leading figures from the Conservative tradition have got it right, way ahead of their time. And I just want to, if you don't mind, I said I only speak for a couple of minutes, but I just do want to read you a couple of things that some of those figures in the past have said, bring it right up to David Cameron and George Osborne. Margaret Thatcher said the core of Tory philosophy and for the case for protecting the environment are the same. No generation has a freehold on this earth. All we have is a life tenancy with a full repairing lease. I'm sure you've heard this before, but it's absolutely spot on. This government intends to meet the terms of that lease in full. Well, she didn't, but she put the issue right on the map in a way that I would love, again, to hear the current Prime Minister do. I mean, it's something which was very much in sync with the discussion before the election, but that now seems more and more like ancient history. And I think one of the things I hope we'll be able to do, and Claire will with her organisation, will be able to help us to achieve, is to remind our leaders today of what it was they were saying so eloquently before the election. David Cameron, he said, Conservatives believe in social order and national security, and it is obvious that our continued reckless disregard for our planet endangers this. We believe that competitive economics has the potential to produce innovation and scientific progress that can turn tackling climate change from a threat to an opportunity. Well, compare that with some of the things we're hearing from the Chancellor today as he delivers his budgets. You couldn't have a wider gulf. George Osborne himself, first Chancellor-in-waiting, or Chancellor, he was a Chancellor-in-waiting at the time, to really delve into the market failure that is environmental crisis that we're talking about today. He nailed it. I forget which city he was in Japan. It wasn't Kyoto, but it was somewhere in Japan, and he delivered a magnificent speech. The carbon emissions that contribute to climate change, he said, are a classic example of what economists call externalities. Since this is a market failure, we need to use market mechanisms to address this problem. Conservatives support markets that work. And Oliver Letwin. Ryan, who's my researcher in Parliament here, worked with Oliver Letwin on much of the environmental policy that made it into the manifesto at the time. And he just nailed it as well, in my view. And Oliver remains, I think, a real ally in this issue. I mean, he's a member of the government in whom I have total confidence, total faith, and I think he's absolutely understands the crisis that we face. Well, he said, the activities down the pathway to the UK becoming a low-carbon economy should be seen as a sort of insurance premium. They buy us protection against the hazards of the future, and they will pay dividends even if the gloomier predictions about global warming are not fulfilled. Dividends in the form of more stable energy costs, improved economic competitiveness, and increased energy security, and so on. So I just want to, before we get into the detailed discussion about what that that means in terms of policy, what's wrong with the language perhaps we've used, how we ourselves have managed to repel members of the Conservative Party, people who see themselves on the centre-right, because we have to take some responsibility for that, in my view. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of that, I would just simply say that the best place we could start is where we were before the election, because we nailed it. We had it, in my view. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much. Zac, I would reiterate that actually for fairly obvious reasons. A few months back, I spent an afternoon going through Hansard looking at the old Thatcher speeches on climate change. Again, I would really recommend them to everyone. They are quite remarkable, and they have been wiped from history a little bit, but they were genuinely ahead of their time. And whatever you think of her politics more broadly, a fascinating starting point for this discussion. And next up, Claire.
Well, this is a relatively new position for me. I only started running the Conservative Environment Network at the beginning of May. And I'd like to thank COIN for their excellent report, and thank you for inviting me to speak on the panel. Today's topic for discussion is super timely, and the case for addressing energy and climate change policy never gets cold. The balance between conserving interests and political principles and putting the right policies in place for both short-term and long-term continue to be a very real challenge. Now, I thought I'd take this opportunity to reintroduce CEN, the Conservative Environment Network. It actually came into existence in 2010 under the leadership of Peter Ainsworth, and has sort of been in the background ever since. However, we believe the time is right now to really push the Conservative Environment Network forward to re-engage the party on environmental issues, including the topic of climate change. Now, our new approach is going to hinge on the following principles: ensuring our legacy for future generations, integrating the environment as a must-be consideration for all policy development, playing out the opportunities for individuals, businesses and the country, and improving competitiveness, placing Britain at the forefront of technological development. Now, making the case for centre-right solutions for environmental problems should be natural Conservative territory. However, somewhere along the way, Conservatives have enabled political responsibility for environmental concerns to shift to the left. Why, do we ask? Environmentalism, being a left-wing concern, is a misunderstood concept in current Conservative thinking and has led to the occasional lack of interest and often hostility towards addressing or prioritising environmental issues. Perhaps because frequently policies addressing environmental concerns have been top-down, regulatory, interventionist. These do not sit well with free marketeering Conservative principles. There may also be a sense of sacrifice for a populist green agenda, which has cost us more than it should, which has turned the heart of the party away. Of course, this is debatable, but in order to move forward, we need to understand and address why and where these perceptions began. The Conservative Environment Network is here to rebuild that natural affiliation for the environment. Caring about the environment is a legitimate and inherent Conservative value, and we need to restate that being a true Tory is to care about the environment. Now, COIN's report surmises that it is in no one's interest for the issue of climate change to be predominantly owned by one group or the other, which is true. All it creates is noise with disproportionate outcomes. However, at present, the debate is so polarised, you are either for or against, without being able to unpick the different elements and find a way through. What we need is a rational centre-ground debate that is not characterised by a pro- and anti-lobby, but is more constructive than that. I've read a number of articles from MPs on the right who would voice legitimate concerns on things like fuel poverty, tackling waste and security of energy supply in a moderate fashion. Yet those same individuals are categorised by the Green lobby as the antis. The result is further disengagement from the Green agenda. This is not a constructive cycle. For example, few would argue against efficiency savings, reducing waste, improving stability and security of energy supply, policies that could potentially lead us to the same place as those who have based their objectives purely on carbon savings. So why do we not address this? One of the roles of CEN is to mobilise and support those who have a very valid case to make, albeit the individual may be against the blight of onshore wind. But that does not mean there's an outright objection to doing what is right to the environment in other ways. So we need to create new narratives for the centre-right. It is clear that rising energy prices and tackling fuel poverty will be a priority policy area for the next election. Labour has already picked up the mantle on this, pressing for retail market reform, and we can hear worried noises from the Conservative backbenches about what their own party is doing to tackle the problem. This we must address as an opportunity to re-engage those individuals with the environmental debate. As the COIN report clearly indicates, there is a distinct lack of vehicle that facilitates both environmental concerns and conservative traditional values to viable policy solutions. I hope that the Conservative Environment Network will fill this void and, as an objective Conservative-led voice, will once again bring environmental principles to the heart of the Conservative Party.
Thank you very much to Claire. And there's a crucial point in there from, not that this is our key topic today, but within the centre-left, there is a huge amount of appetite beyond the knockabout daily fun and games of Parliament to try and build a consensus on this and work together. A lot of the ideas do overlap, and a lot of the ideas aren't neatly put into one place on the spectrum, and as such, having a centre-right, strong centre-right voice enables much better engagement with a centre-left voice to actually try and build some centrist solutions that genuinely work and can command popular support. And on that note, we move to our last speaker, Guy Newey from Policy Exchange.
Thanks, James, and thanks to Adam for pushing me to get this event organised, and thank you all for coming here today. There's 4 key points I want to make following on from what we've heard. The first is, don't panic. There's still a high level of public support for action on climate change, and there's still a hell of a lot of policy taking place in terms of tackling climate change in the UK, at least. The second key point is the danger of conflating a policy scepticism with a climate scepticism. Confusing these two is extremely damaging, and is often a deliberate tactic, political tactic. I want to get into some of the nitty-gritty of what Adam's suggesting and talk about what I see as some of the risks of some of the 4 responses in terms of whether you'll actually be successful in convincing people. And the 4th point I want to make, and Theresa May stole the line for her speech, but motives matter. Why are you doing what you're doing? And I argue that many on the centre-right have been poor at exactly explaining clearly why they're doing. So 1, let's not panic too much. Public support for climate change remains high. It's higher than many areas where we get policy action. In broad terms, a large majority of the public agrees to some extent climate change is happening, declined a little in recent years. Large majority agree that human activities are contributing to global warming. Majority are concerned about climate change, although it's not necessarily the #1 environmental issue. I think Ipsos Mori said about a quarter would put it as their #1 environmental issue. So what follows on from that kind of high levels of support? Well, 1, do not expect that people have to agree or understand every aspect of the science to agree to action. I think there's generally a danger in the debate of fixing on people who are challenging the science or challenging a particular aspect of the science and spending a lot of our time arguing about those issues. To me, it kind of suggests a bit of paranoia about how confident you are in the science. I think Ed Davies' speech recently, talking about worries about what newspapers were printing, kind of fits in with that category. I think it's important to read opposition blogs who with positions you don't agree with. Go back, check what you think, and come back stronger. One of the other arguments about how we build a kind of greater sense or greater group of people who want to argue for action on this is the need to establish a common cause. And I think Adam's report explains that quite well. And the argument being that otherwise action will only ever be superficial. We'll all go, oh, well, I've recycled this week, so I can not worry about climate change. Again, this goes to the point of motives matter, but I'm not necessarily sure it's necessary to get policy and even radical policy action. The key, you're not going to get people to agree on the precise course of action that you want, and you should celebrate people who disagree with that. The key is not, and this is leaning on kind of Roger Pielka's work, the key is not getting people to agree, it's getting people who disagree to do what you want them to do. So I'm going to briefly run through what I see as the kind of taxonomy of the different groups in the Tory or centre-right debate in terms of climate change. And I'm happy to be corrected. This is based on only my own experience and who I talk to. So there is a group that doesn't accept the science. I'd say that's an extraordinarily small group in the debate. The second group is what I would call the optimists. They're actually pretty relaxed about climate change. They see that it's happening, they think there's some human effect, but we don't need to worry about it too much. Future generations will be richer, and they'll be able to sort it out if it does turn out to be as big a problem as everyone says it is. The third group is the kind of techno-optimists, I guess. People who are worried about it think we should do something about it, but you have a huge focus on R&D, and a kind of minor carbon tax. I guess a kind of Hartwell thesis people would be one area in this. Then there's a bigger group, which I'd probably put myself in, which are kind of policy skeptics. So just not convinced that the current policy approaches are going to achieve the kind of global carbon reductions that are required. Tends to be more focused on markets working properly rather than central planning. Very keen on taxing the pollution and allowing businesses to compete, suspicious of kind of crony capitalism in that sense. And then there's probably another group who are more interventionist in this area. Markets won't deliver low carbon, need government support, decisions need to be planned, etc. Now, one of the dangers of people talking about this area, and one of the deliberate tactics that opponents use, is an effort to try and conflate some of these groups. The worst example of this was Chris Huhne's phrase, green economy deniers. It's a kind of brilliant effort to join together climate denial with people who don't think that £95 a megawatt hour is a good value for nuclear power. And I think that's actually caused a lot of the frustration. It has become heavily politicized in that sense. We probably saw it with the 2030 decarbonisation target debate as well. So what do I see as the risks of what Adam, some of the messages that Adam is suggesting? And I think the report's very interesting and really good start to the debate. But I just want to, as much as for debate as anything else, want to raise some of the risks. So the localism message, that if we engender the sense of local pride in our area, then we will be able to tackle climate change problem. Well, what does that mean for wind farms? How does opposition to a wind farm application fit with a local environmental agenda? Does this lead us to focus much more on adaptation measures, so our local community is protected, we are ready, we'll help each other out, rather than mitigation, which I think is still needed? Adam's second frame talks about energy security, and this I find the most difficult, and probably the one I disagree with is the most. So are we more secure with and I exaggerate, a weather-dependent energy system, or one that relies on gas from Norway and Qatar? Is free trade not a really good way of getting energy security? By the way, I think that energy security is a message that really does resonate with the public. The polling sees it as very important. But I think it's risky in this debate if you try and build an argument around that, because it's in many ways it's the same as taking extreme weather events and linking them directly to climate change. You hold up the possibility that people can put holes in your argument, and raising wider suspicion about action, and again about motives. Green economy, green jobs, the kind of new environmentalism, that area. Again, I feel pretty uncomfortable about this. I don't think the aim of policy should be to create as many green jobs as possible. If that was the case, we, instead of advocating wind turbines, we should be advocating giant human-driven hamster wheels. I exaggerate, but the green jobs argument does lead you down that path. We should be looking to generate energy as cheaply as possible while decarbonising. This, of course, will lead to jobs. We will get new sectors popping up, but that should not be the primary aim. And there's not strong evidence, as far as I can see, and I'm happy to be corrected, that making electricity more expensive leads to an overall net jobs benefit. Again, you open yourself up to being criticised. The public health argument, I'm not expert on the evidence. It's certainly a powerful one when you're talking about air quality, but again, it gets you into difficult areas when you talk about electricity sector. What does it mean for biomass? Can climate change and public health be directly linked? Electric vehicles, these are all complicated areas. So I will cautiously put forward some other ones, other messages that we think might be, that I think might be potentially important. Well, one is essentially the risk-based argument, the resilient argument. Climate change presents a risk to the prosperity of humanity and, of course, the natural environment. That's a pretty good reason for doing something about it, and a good reason to motivate action that ensures us against that. It's the difference between a resilient economy and a energy-secure, energy-independent economy. That would lead you down the path to taking lots of no-regrets options, the kind of cheapest measures that have lots of benefits beyond climate. And then the second argument that I think is important, and Zac's mentioning of Margaret Thatcher's speech about that this is not a freehold was exactly part of that. So climate change should be seen as part of efforts to improve the environment, not some kind of special cause. Roger Scruton's green philosophy book is remarkable in this area. This isn't the argument about stewardship, an argument that I find very powerful. We have a responsibility to generations past and future generations. Exactly that kind of argument that Margaret Thatcher made about not a freehold. And the final point I'd like to make is that point about motives and why motives matter, and which is where we've got tangled up in the last 3 years, because there has been huge policy intervention. We've just signed an energy bill which is going to see kind of 9 billion worth of investment in low carbon. That's a huge policy intervention, and we could fight about whether that's the right move or the wrong move. But if you don't convince people we're doing this because we think this is important, because this is going to lead to a more resilient economy, this is going to mitigate against risks, then people are very suspicious of why you're doing it. Crucially, as part of that, why your motives, is that you've got to stress that you're doing it in the fairest way possible, that the measures you're taking are cost-effective, what we like to call greener, cheaper at Policy Exchange, but that you're not burdening the poorest members of society. Now, we could get into a fight about whether the current policy matches that description, but I think that should be at the heart of a centre-right message on climate change. Thanks.
Thank you, Guy. And we already have two at the panel mild disagreement, so good starting point for a conversation. We're going to open this up for questions. We've got about 35 minutes, but we have to finish sharply at 1:45. Therefore, could I please ask, and I know everyone asks this, but could you please keep your questions brief? Could you please keep them to the point? Could you please not make too many superfluous points? I don't like being rude, but I will interrupt you, and then I'll feel awkward, and everyone will feel awkward, and it'll just be horrible. So just keep it short and sharp. That would be fantastic. And we'll start with, I think the gentleman here had his arm up first. Oh, and also identify yourself, obviously.
Hi. My name is Peter Coe-Harris from Green Economics Institute in Reading. The question I'd like to put to the panel is, when there is a sort of fundamental disagreement between energy policy and conservation, I would maybe posit the idea of the Severn barrage. How do you facilitate a sort of understanding between the conservation-minded and the sort of future energy needs?
Immediately we have a question that could take forever to answer because it is such a complex issue. Zac, do you want to take that one first?
Really, you've actually picked probably the hardest possible example to answer, because you without wanting to sound too much like a politician, which of course I am, but you do have to measure, you have to weigh up all the arguments in this. And I personally am drawn to some of the alternatives which are being put forward, which are effectively a much more decentralized version of the Severn barrage, which I think from a conservation point of view, I'm not an expert and I don't want to be pushed on this because my ignorance will be exposed very quickly. But I think from the point of view of conservation, it makes more sense in terms of cost and timeliness. I think it also makes more sense. But it is difficult. I mean, I think that the everyday example that's given where there's this apparent conflict is wind. And Guy touched on this in the context of the localism agenda. Well, I think you do have to, you can't be a headbanger about it. There are some places where wind is appropriate. There are some places where it's not appropriate. There are some communities which will never embrace wind. There are others which are much more relaxed about it. And I think that the localist, more democratic agenda would make the whole process of the rollout of wind much more acceptable, much less contentious, and you'd find that there are far fewer battles of the sort that we're seeing at the moment. Nuclear power is popular in France because of the way they do it. You get a slice of the action is given to the local communities affected. It's much less, even though you're talking about a much bigger technology, it's much less top-down in a strange way than wind is in England. Wales, I think, are way ahead of us on this. Much less opposition to wind because of the way they do it, because of the process. So I wouldn't back away from the localism agenda on this, and that does mean occasionally not winning if you're a renewable energy person.
No, case-by-case basis, it seems. Sorry.
Well, just a quick point on the wind turbines, just because they're not contentious at all. I mean, I think they illustrate a point. They have certain physical characteristics, but they also have a huge amount of cultural meaning attached to them. So in and of themselves, they don't mean very much at all, but some people look at them and see optimism and hope for the future. Other people see an outside force coming in and without consultation, putting their stamp on their land. So the question of whether do wind farms conflict with a kind of localism agenda, I don't know that they do. I mean, you can very much put the impacts of climate change as being a bigger threat to the countryside than wind turbines would ever be.
You took one question about tidal energy and we're already on to wind farms. Sorry, I'll say the next person.
Hi, Alistair Harper of Green Alliance. One piece of work we do is with green conservatism. We have three processes, the three traditions, one of which is green conservatism, which Zac and Guy are involved with. And I see with that there is no philosophical barrier to good conservative-owned solutions to environmental problems. But we don't live in a world that likes that. We live in a world that likes in, out, this side, that side. And it occurred to me when I was reading Nicholas Ridley's autobiography, he had a moan about Greens, Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth, who were obsessed with landscape, and that was the only way they considered environment. Whereas him and Margaret Thatcher, they cared about the big issues. They cared about global warming, and that's why they were the serious people. And you just see that's just a narrative shift. There is the same, his relative, Owen Paterson, dislikes similar people for completely the opposite reasons. So how much of this is just the political system we have of opposition and conflict?
Okay.
I think it sort of slightly touches on what I was saying about polarising the debate there, and it seems to me, it almost seems that there are some situations where if it's the left takes a view, the right view is the opposite, and there's this pro and anti argument again. But I think you're entirely right. I think the arguments can shift around depending upon where the opposition lies. And so, it's a prime example that, is conservation also good environmental practice, or is sustainability and sometimes change is also good environmental practice? So I think, again, it has to depend on A, on the situation, and B, where the opposition lies.
The key question, is it not, are there steps that we can take to start to depoliticise that process? I mean, can we, is it too difficult to put the genie back in the bottle, or is there a way to start to try and get everyone to just calm down a bit? Zac?
I think actually the question had the answer in it, because, and you picked a good example there. You've got, I used to think when I ran the Ecologist magazine, I thought that if you told the truth and you told enough people, everything would be okay. Because people are basically rational and the arguments are so strong. But it's not the case. I've never met a more irrational bunch of people than the people I work with day in, day out in Parliament. And the best example of that is probably nuclear, where you've got people who, because of the old association with CND, the people on the right, they love nuclear because that means hating the people who used to be against nuclear because they've mixed up the weapons and the energy bit. But it is as crude and simplistic as that. So you could have someone who is an absolute headbanger on subsidies, absolute rejection of any kind of use of government subsidies at all, because they don't believe in subsidies. Let the market do it all, don't interfere. And yet they're obsessed with nuclear power. There's never been a nuclear power plant ever built without subsidies, and it doesn't matter how often you say that to these people, they will turn a blind eye, because it's not about the actual arguments. I think if we're too purist about it, if we think let's just go out and come up with the best policy and argue in a pure and intelligent way, we'll find our way through, we won't. A lot of it is about gut, it's about politics, it's about the crude emotional arguments as much as it is about all the stuff we're talking about at the moment.
Cool. Thank
I
you.
wouldn't credit them with too much intelligence.
So many hands. The gentleman here has had his hand up for quite a while, and once we've had this one, we will start taking 2 or 3 together to up the pace a little bit. Sorry, sir.
John, could the panel comment, please, upon the significance of fracking for both the environment and the economy?
I like the conciseness of the question and the massive complexity of it at the same time. Guy, you have a position on fracking, I believe, or?
Yeah, we do. In that, well, my position is that there's huge potential, there's huge uncertainty. The best way to get the potential benefits in terms of lower bills that may or may not appear, but also to make sure you take forward the environmental risks, is to make sure you've got a good carbon pricing regime, so that people who are making the decisions on whether they drill or don't drill can factor that into their decision making. Not that so if they think there's going to be an extremely constrained carbon environment in 2030, then they have to understand that their product's going to be more expensive. If they want to take that risk and they still think they can make money, that's fine. But I'd much rather they make the decision than governments do.
With or without generous tax breaks?
I don't think the industry want tax breaks particularly on this. I mean, well, I don't know.
Unfortunately, he's not here. Would be good. Claire.
Well, to start with, I think at the moment it's very, very early days. And we are still only in an exploration phase. There's an awful lot of unknowns, and I think to make sweeping assumptions at this stage is hard. I think to rule it out as an abject kind of never is at this stage would be maybe shooting down opportunity. But I do think it has to be done on a very, very slowly, cautious basis. I think, as I said, there are a lot of unknowns, and I wouldn't be prepared at this stage to commit one way or the other. I think we have to look at the case as it stands now, and sort of gently does it, really.
Well, I broadly agree with that. I don't think we know enough about the carbon emissions. It's very hard to describe it as a good or a bad step in relation to carbon. I think realistically gas is going to be a bridging fuel for. I don't see any way around that. Much as some people in the environmental movement are opposed to that, I think it's inevitable. I think what would be insane would be for our policymakers to map the future of our economy on the assumption that we're going to have the same experience here that we're beginning to see in the United States, which seems to be what's happening in the government at the moment. And I think that's just crazy, because we really do not know anything like enough to be able to do that. And we should focus on those things where there is certainty, i.e. energy efficiency. It's just a no-brainer, and it's been left behind so many times and so often.
I mean, I think Damien Carrington at The Guardian got this one right and said that if there's going to be broader public consultation and involvement around wind farms, as there should be, then that would have to happen for things like fracking too, and there will be absolutely every bit as much public contestation around fracking as there is around things like wind turbines. Every energy technology is contested, and I think that actually we're missing a trick in the way that certain technologies are advanced, in that the choice is never between this wind turbine or nothing, the Severn barrage or nothing. It's some combination of choices, some energy mix of the future, but very, very rarely is the energy system presented to people like that as a whole, I think.
Exactly right.
Yeah, the other last point on gas is that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor sort of said we want to go down a sort of pro-gas path, which is entirely fair enough, and they have mentioned several times that carbon capture and storage is key to that in the future and making that compliant with our carbon budgets, which is great and entirely rational. However, our carbon capture and storage strategy is a farce. So if you want to go down the gas route, we really do need to be doing a bit more on CCS. Many questions. We've had a few from, so let's go to one here and then one behind.
I'm interested, Robin Webster from Carbon Brief. I'm interested in the report's presentation of the centre-right. By just talking about the centre-right, are you saying that there is parts of the right that can't be reached, or is it just that everybody likes to think they're in the centre?
And let's take the two from behind as well at the same time. And then part of the room is done.
Jess Leonard from Edelman. Just wondered, we're all sort of familiar with this idea of battle fatigue when you overdo the climate message and tell everyone the world's going to end, and of course it doesn't, and everybody thinks, well, I can forget about that then. But the other side of that, of course, is people seeing climate change, tackling climate change as a nice to have. And as Zac was pointing out from the 2008 speech, very much it seems to be a sort of fair weather issue in politics. What do you think can be done on the centre-right using, as you've all mentioned, this kind of cross-generational stewardship idea to maybe help this bit of the political space solve that problem?
Thank you. Sheila Wren from the John Muir Trust. What does the panel think about a future energy mix would look like, a realistic energy mix that's carbon friendly but also keeps the lights on?
Wow, big questions again.
Future
Do we just, in this debate, do we just ignore certain parts of the far right's probably the wrong word, but the hardest of the right who just reject it completely? Do we ignore them, or do we continue to engage with them? Seems to be the question.
I'll have a go at that if you want.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we shouldn't ignore them. I think you're right, by the way. Everyone sees themselves as centre-right, wherever they are on the spectrum. But I think it would be a mistake to ignore. I mean, I'll give you one example is John Hayes. And he became a kind of bogeyman for many in the Green movement during his time as energy minister. The odd thing is that I have shared a platform with John Hayes for years on many occasions, long before I became a Tory MP, before I was a candidate, when I was the editor of The Ecologist. And we would agree on so many issues relating to localisation, balance of power in our high streets, the problem of the Tescopoly, so many issues where we were in agreement. I think we, environmentalists, actually made a really strategic error in not engaging with John Hayes because we saw him as someone on the right of the party who was just a bad guy who doesn't understand climate change. Completely misunderstood him. I think it would be perfectly possible well, I know it's possible because I have sat down with him and discussed wind, for example, and found areas or even positions where we can both agree. It is possible with John Hayes as a localist, someone who believes very strongly in local democracy, that if you added a layer of local democracy, you didn't force these things on communities, he'd be up for it. He doesn't like the idea of subsidies for wind, but nor do we. Subsidies will be phased out for the wind sector over the next 2, 3, 4 years in any case. So there's no real disagreement. And I think the reaction of the Green movement to some of the things that John Hayes was saying was, I think, quite puerile and counterproductive. So I think, no, we shouldn't ignore anyone in the right. We should try and build bridges wherever it's possible to build them, because the issue's just too big for that. It's too big for the games that sometimes we see in this area.
And in many ways related, how do we stop this becoming a fair weather issue? Guy, this time stop.
Just on that right and left, well, I tend to find right and left pretty unhelpful generally in the political debate because it pigeonholes you very quickly.
Just people in general? Is that
No, I mean as terms, because people already make up their mind. I mean that taxonomy I gave about people on this issue could equally apply to the Labour Party in lots of ways. You have people who are in the Labour Party who kind of get how markets work and against capitalism, and you have people who are as corporatist as anyone. There are huge crossovers, and there'll be plenty of people in the Tory party who would sit perfectly comfortably in the Labour Party and vice versa. So I try and get away from it as much as possible, actually talking about kind of policies. Jessica talked about what's needed in the political space on this. Well, we need a big speech by a big politician on environment issues. That's, that we need the PM or the Chancellor, and Zac's absolutely right to send that back.
You really think that would help? It would be that would re-embolden things that quickly? Because the Prime Minister's given several speeches and he's hidden them. I mean, this has happened in the last year. He's given 2 quite big speeches where he was passionately pro-renewables and passionately pro-action on energy efficiency. And they were both either deliberately or... They were deliberately hidden. And they didn't get the coverage. And it's a shame. How do we tackle this fair weather issue? Sorry.
Well, just on that point of whether sort of left to right is a useful distinction, I mean, I think it is useful here. We thought quite carefully about how to present the report. It's about people with centre-right views. It doesn't mean they'll vote Conservative. They might be small c Conservative. But I think the themes that we've identified in that, the ways of talking about climate change to this audience, probably don't apply to people with strongly neoliberal beliefs. That's a completely different conversation. It doesn't mean they shouldn't be spoken to at all, that you shouldn't try and engage with people, but I guess it's starting where the obvious areas of overlap, as everyone said today. There seems to be some really obvious, easy win overlaps between moderate conservatism and climate change.
Yeah, and finally, on Jess's question, I mean, it's interesting that you use the term climate change. I mean, you may have noticed I talked a lot about environmentalism, and I think actually when we say climate change, we sort of segment it out as a kind of an individual entity, and actually it's something that's intertwined with all these other policy areas, and we need to talk about it as a whole entity. And actually talking about environmentalism rather than climate change actually might shift the debate in terms of tackling that issue.
And the future energy mix. President Obama has a nice phrase of all of the above, which is controversial with many environmentalists. But I mean, is that, in a nutshell, is it that diversified approach, or?
Yeah, I think that's inevitable. I mean, I know that I wouldn't trust myself to be at the very top of government picking winners. I don't think there's a good track record in governments of doing that. You set the framework and you get things going. I think that one of the problems with the new reforms we're seeing at the moment is they are very centralised, and it will come down to decisions being made by ministers. And as we know, politics is an amateur's game in this country. It's a strength, but it's also a weakness. It's possible, though highly unlikely, that in a year's time I could be running a department of government with no more experience than anyone else in this room, or even my children. That's the way politics works. So I'd be concerned about having too much of a central command and control structure around these issues. I'd much rather see government set the framework and let the technologies emerge.
Absolutely. So many questions. I must take some from this side of the room. So go right to the back, gentleman at the back, and then next to him, and then the gentleman in the tie there. That 1, 2, and then the gentleman in the tie.
Sunny Hundle from Liberal Conspiracy. I have a question from a more partisan left perspective. How should you? I mean, you say that debates get polarized, but from a left perspective, it's difficult not to attack the right when you have people who are climate change deniers promoted to pretty front bench positions. And I suppose the perspective is, if you don't attack and you don't frame the government in that way, questioning the sort of previous claims that they were going to be the most green government ever, then a Tory party could say, well, no one's attacking us, therefore we're just going to carry on. So how should we change our approach? Why shouldn't we attack from the left and say you're not being green enough and you're pushing climate change deniers?
Interesting. Sorry, let's just take the other two quickly, and then we'll.
Sam Barker from Tier Fund. I wonder, just quickly, whether humanitarianism is another avenue in. We do a lot of work with the Christian Republican right in the US. My question to the panel is, what's the sort of role for NGOs, and what can we best do to create good political space?
And there was a gentleman in the tie just there.
James Cooper from the Woodland Trust. I just follow on from the point Alistair made. I think part of the problem is it's not been enough about landscape, and it's sort of re-anchoring it in the natural environment and land management that's the key to getting the people like the John Hayes on board. But my question to the panel was whether the problem isn't partly a presentational one, in the sense that of all policy areas, this is one of those that's most often seen as technocratic, and that immediately rubs up against that natural kind of centre-right scepticism about technocracy, and how we can sort of move away from it.
Cool. First question is fascinating. I mean, how do we take the heat out of the issue when it's the right attack dogs that seem to be putting the heat into this? And as someone who writes about this as a climate hawk and gets a shed load of abuse on Twitter for doing so, I sympathise massively. So, I mean, Zac, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, to come back. I mean, Sunny, I follow you on Twitter. I had no idea you were left-wing. But I'm going to combine these two questions, if you don't mind, because the NGO question directly relates, I think, to your one, and that is that I don't think it's wrong to attack the. It can be expected that any party, whether they're in government or not, has an approach to dealing with these issues. So when you see a party moving away from having any kind of approach to dealing with these issues, directly against things that it said before an election, before it went out and asked people to vote for it, you're entitled, you're obliged to, if you care about these issues, to hit that government or that party with a stick. So I don't think we should all be all friends all the time. It's not, the point is not to back away and avoid the politics. Politics has a place, and I think it's everyone's job, your job, NGOs' jobs and so on, to batter the government or the parties or the individuals when they get it wrong. And I think an example of where the party clearly was appointing people on the basis of chucking a bit of red meat to some people on the backbenches who are climate skeptic, who are uninterested in these issues, it is your job to come forward and point that out. So I wouldn't ever caution anyone against doing that. But I would say this to the NGOs, that the strategic thing to do is not just to attack the Conservative Party or to attack the government, but there are some really good people there. Someone like Greg Barker, absolute ally with us. Ed Davey, a different party to myself, has done a lot of good stuff. I don't agree with him on everything, but he's doing a lot of good work. Where you have allies in the party, big them up. Because if you just attack the whole lot, I think you demoralize the party, you demoralize those people who feel that they can never win with the Green movement. And I think your job is to embolden those people who we need to embolden and weaken those people that you need to weaken. It's just, as a strategy, that's I think, an area where we've fallen short, or where environmentalists have fallen short in the past.
Anyone else like to come out?
I guess it's just a question of what do you gain by attacking at that level. So take, for example, someone like Owen Paterson. Is it the case that he's expressing sceptical views about climate change because he's examined the scientific evidence base and found it wanting? Or is it because he doesn't like the sound of the policy solutions that are on the table? And my sense is it's the latter. And that's where the motivation for the uncertainty is coming from. You have to start from that end, not just a kind of argument about whether people are right or wrong about the science. It feels like it's tempting, but it's combative, and it doesn't really get anywhere in the end.
I think I don't think you should take the politics out of it. I think it'd be extraordinarily naive to think that there wouldn't be any politics in it, and efforts to try and get everyone on the same side and everyone singing from the same hymn sheet is just not going to happen, and nor should it. It'd be horrendous. North Korea is not a nice place. But that means there will be a policy fight, and we should all get comfortable with a policy fight. I mean, somebody says something on the science you disagree with, bang, go back at the science. I talked about the phrase that Chris Huhn used, the green economy deniers phrase, and for me that deserves punchback straight away, because that is putting off that's putting everyone who criticises his particular chosen policy and saying, oh, well, you're denying everything about climate change. So, it's a fight. It's a policy fight, and what I'd say is, my kind of key message is, yes, there's a fight going on and there's people disagreeing, but the policy's moving forward, at least in the UK. I mean, we are generally, let's sit back and say, actually, we're pretty good in terms of low carbon policy. I mean, I don't agree with all of it, and that's why I do what I do for Policy Exchange. But we are on climate change issue. We're in a pretty good place compared to the rest of the world.
I guess adding to that, it's about making those sweeping generalisations. I think exactly as Zac said, there are those within the Conservative Party who don't want to be branded with the broader kind of, they are anti-environmentalists, they act in this way. And actually they'd be very prepared and willing to speak up if they felt they had the support and there was something to win and something to gain with a relationship with the NGOs, for example. And I think it's about targeting your approaches rather than just making sweeping generalisations.
It would help if more of them did stand up, though. I think that would be
precisely. Well, one of the roles, and hopefully that's something that the Conservative Environment Network will be looking to do, is actually encourage that and drawing that out of a lot of the party members.
So I think it ran to the last question again. Sorry, what was the last question, very quickly?
It was briefly about how you avoid the sense that this is a very technocratic, centralist issue, and avoiding the fact that just rubs up against natural centre-right scepticism about it.
Yeah, I mean, that's an absolutely huge question, isn't it? Does the centre-left lead on this? Because the most logical solutions to this are naturally the centre-left solutions. I mean, that's certainly been Will Hutton's view. He's argued very eloquently that the right has a problem here because it's just can't find a coherent solution, I presume.
But the historical example, Zac talked about the historical examples of where, the right-wing governments have passed quite aggressive legislation.
But I think the question is correct. The point James has just made is correct, is that because the right have been so hopeless on this issue for so long, and we have, but really, so going back to Thatcher, there's been a great long period of time where we haven't attempted to find solutions. So all the solutions that are out there have been developed by the left, not the right, until recently. And therefore, those solutions look unattractive to the right, and they're even less likely then to jump on that particular bandwagon. So there's no doubt that's an issue. Our job is to, I mean, I think all political parties, as I said, are becoming aboard now, have to develop an approach. But where the debate should be, in a really healthy world, the debate should be about who has the best solutions. And for a brief moment, that's where we were before the election. There was an arms race mentality. There was a competition. But when Cameron was made leader, and the Labour Party, and the Lib Dems were somewhere in there, I think, I can't remember, but they were all arguing about who had the best ideas, who had the best solutions, and it was a really positive development. And we were developing some good ideas. And I think our manifesto had some really good ideas. I think the Green Investment Bank actually is one of them. It's one of the success stories, which... That was a laugh. I thought it was a cynical laugh. It was a cough.
not from that man. It's not.
I was about to debate. We met yesterday. So I think that's where we need to get the debate back again. Let's argue about what happened. You really want me to answer that? I can try and answer that. What happened? I think what happened is that the economy went pear-shaped, and there was a lot of panic and a lot of pressure. Panic in the Treasury, which immediately, where the Chancellor just dropped all this stuff and said, we just got to get growth. Doesn't matter what it looks like, we'll get growth. If we have to develop our mothers and our parks and our communities, fine, we'll do it. Just anything for growth. That became the panic mentality of the Treasury, and I think that a lot of people on the back benches who are not particularly engaged with these issues just fell in behind that. So our struggle has been to try and remind the party, remind the government, that there is such a thing as green growth, that it is possible to create jobs and stimulate the economy, just as that quote I read from Oliver Letwin, which I think encapsulated it perfectly at the end of my introduction to this. That's the message we need to get out there.
We have 10 minutes. I'd like to take as many questions as possible because there's lots of people still waiting to ask questions. So I'll just take last two from this side of the room. Sorry, the gentleman there in the coat and the lady in front of him, and then we'll come down to this corner.
Hello, good afternoon. John Algar from Bright Blue. My question is for Adam. Do you have any individual case studies, so policymakers or leaders on the centre-right who might have been sceptical and after being explained the evidence in the ways you're setting out have genuinely shifted their mindset? So I guess it just give us some, I suppose,
some hope that this
optimism.
Works. Yeah. And lady in front there.
Hi, Alice Bell, Science Policy Research Unit, University of Sussex. First of all, you might be interested that the noise outside is apparently that no to tar sands protesters have occupied the roof of Parliament. Seems a bit weird that we're sitting here talking about public engagement with wind farms. I don't know how that'll play out. But my question was that it's kind of a bit off Sonny's in that he was saying, why shouldn't the left criticise on the denial? But I think that the problem between left and right is not going to be on whether people believe it or not, it's what we do about it. And certainly when I talk to people on the left, some of the things they're most worried about is it's not the climate skeptics, it's the geoengineers. And it's what are the differences of what we do about particularly energy policy, is, I think, is where you're going to see the left and right polarisation, and also Greens in the middle, sometimes fighting with both. And so I wanted to know what people thought about that. What's that? If we do solve the scepticism problem, is there a constructive way out of that blockage between what we do about climate change being very different from a left and a right-wing perspective?
And there's a big question. The case study issue first. I mean, any evidence this works, hopefully? Please.
Any evidence that the one individual has actually been persuaded?
Yeah, I mean, either in the UK or just a favourite example.
Well, I mean, I think this event today is evidence that there are the first shoots, at least, of that happening. Well, not the first shoots, but the re-interest in this happening. But I think it's picking up on Alice's point, really, that we just have to move this away from being a debate about climate change scepticism, about the science. That's a proxy for what people are really talking about, which is what do we do about it. And I see no conflict whatsoever. Once there's a multiplicity of answers on the table, people feel comfortable, they come at this from their own perspective, from their own value base. This isn't something that's associated with others. There's absolutely no reason why this isn't something that fits really naturally with the centre-right. But I mean, anyone else can help me out.
It's always worth the constant reminder that it's already worked to a huge extent with large numbers of people. I mean, the energy bill last week was voted against by 8 people. the vast majority of the Conservative Party is in favour of massive decarbonisation. They don't say it publicly because a small minority with very vocal newspapers would slaughter them for doing so. But actually, the policy's there and there's broad political support for it. We argue on the nuance a lot, but most people do accept there's a problem, and they probably have been convinced by some of the arguments set out. Part of the problem we do have is the media problem of that being completely concealed. The broader question on what to do about it, I mean, it's so big it's ridiculous. But anyone, Claire, I mean, where do you see...
You have that
first.
What to do about climate change?
Good.
Sorry, could you sort of repeat the nuance of that
Well,
question?
just more broadly, that even if we had an agreement on the need to act,
Yep.
where next, basically? I mean, it's...
Well, I think if we could get agreement on where to act, that would be an amazing step forward, I think. And then the where next is about, as Zach was saying, it's about the best solutions and the best policies to implement that. I don't think... I haven't got a looking glass. I mean, I can't really sort of...
The thing is this, is that you've got... I think you're right. You said that there's more or less a consensus there on the need to act. And Guy said at the beginning, very few people in that first category are sceptics. Even someone like Peter Lilly, I know that it was a terrible experience in this very room a year ago, which I wasn't here, but I hear about it, and I'm going to be looking it up on YouTube later. However, he is someone who's not a sceptic. I read his complaint. He sent a very long complaint to the BBC about biased coverage on climate change. But even within that complaint, there's an absolute acceptance there, explicit acceptance of the IPC science. His concern is with the mechanics of it all. So I think that bit's almost done. I wouldn't want to be complacent, but it's almost done. I think there will always be a debate about who has got the best solutions, which is the best approach. And if you're on the left, you're going to favour left-wing approaches. If you're on the right, you're always going to favour the more right-wing approaches. And that's healthy and it's natural. But in the sort of grown-up world, clearly, you can't just leave this all to the market. If you could leave it to the market, then we wouldn't have these problems in the first place. All environmental problems that I can think of are the result of some form of market blindness or market failure. George Osborne acknowledged that in 2007. It's undeniable. But equally, the state doesn't always get it right. So it's going to have to be a blend. There's going to have to be a bit of let it go, create the market framework in some areas and provide a bit of direction in others. I just can't see that there's any grown-up alternative interpretation than that, actually. It just seems blindingly obvious, and that is where I hope we'll end up at some point.
There's also the position I take of the centrist climate hawk of we need to do it all very, very quickly. I mean, just let's try it all, let's get this stuff out there and get it rolled out and get it happening. Guy, sorry.
Zach's exactly right. Most people support action on climate change, and that's pretty good for policy positions. Probably there's been high-profile cases where policy has been enacted where that's probably wasn't the case, and we should kind of celebrate that. Just briefly on the geoengineering point, which Alice, correct me if I'm wrong, but you seem to raise in the kind of we should be terrified of this kind of way. I'd recommend another one of our great events that we had recently on geoengineering, which discussed one of those issues, and it's such a broad range of technologies. And Friends of the Earth agree with me. You're going to need to have some of those solutions as part of tackling climate change. It's a massive problem, and that doesn't mean we should all be pumping sulphur into the stratosphere. But there are plenty of other things before we get to that.
We will take two more last very quick questions. The gentleman down here is waiting very patiently, and then the gentleman behind him, and I'm afraid that will be that.
Thank you. I'm George Marshall. I work with Adam for COIN. And my question, which I haven't heard yet answered so far, is about the communicators. We did a lot of work with the Welsh government, and you can test these messages, by the way. You can go out. We did 16 focus groups across Wales. It's a very large piece of work for the Welsh government to try and find what language works. When we did that, we found a lot of what Adam was saying works across the board, because, as we say, this is not just party political, it's across the board. And then when we tried to sell them the vision stuff, they said, who's telling us this? If it's a bloody politician, I don't believe a word of it. And when Guy here says, well, what we need is a strong political speech, yes, we do, but the critical way that people receive information and form beliefs is on the basis of their peers. So I guess the question is, how do we galvanise a conversation amongst people with shared conservative politics and shared values, such they're hearing it from each other in their Conservative Party or at work or from people who they already know and trust?
Fascinating question. And sorry, gentleman there. It's the last question, so make it a good one.
Michael Stork, Luther Pendragon. Fundamentally, people care about costs and how much their energy bills are. And we keep talking about what are the messages we can give. aren't there any messages about price that will resonate and we can use to connect with the right wing and indeed the general public?
Two very good questions. The first one first. I mean, how do we get this language right? Adam, I presume you've already spoken to George at length about this. So, Claire, I mean, the language at the moment is poor, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think as someone mentioned earlier, it's a very sort of technocrat type brief, and I think part of it is actually translating it into a language that people can understand and is tangible to them. It means something. And I think at the moment it's almost seen as climate change is this sort of distant phenomenon. There's no direct impact, no direct effect on me. But I also do think it is important. Okay, people might not directly listen to their politicians first off, but it is translated through the media, and it's a process. And I think that, you know, if you can get the senior politicians to show leadership on this, it will filter down through to the grassroots of the party. And what you might actually see is, you know, people having discussions in their local pub about these kind of issues. And I think that we can get to that stage, but we have to see leadership from the top for that to happen.
Anyone else something to add on that?
I just worry that we won't. Politicians tend not to lead on the whole. They tend to respond. And it will never be the case that, well, put it this way, by the time it is the case that you ask 100 people in a room, what's your top concern? And where a majority say the environment, broadly speaking, we're already stuffed at that point. Because it's not the most immediate concern for really anyone. You ask people, what's your concern? If they haven't got a house, it's housing. If they're worried about local schools, it's schools. It's not the immediate concern for most people. So if we have to wait until people are screaming and yelling, it's game over at that point. So I do think we need to find a way, I think, of pressuring politicians without relying on superficial opinion polls. And I think there have been some examples of that in the last, since I've been an MP, 2 or 3 years, surprising issues that have become really big suddenly, where I felt as an MP enormous pressure from constituents on issues that I would not have predicted as issues beforehand. And I think that kind of political activism is something, an area where I think we need to become more sophisticated. But the point about believability is key, and that applies not just to the environment, that applies across the board. And that's a crisis of our politics, which is for another day.
And on the cost question, I mean, absolutely crucial, not just for the centre-right, but for the entire environmental movement. How do we get away from this being seen as something that we just can't afford? I mean, Guy, I know you've... Well,
your narrative is... I was going to a conference once, I had a taxi driver, and I explained what it was I did, which is very difficult, you know. My mother doesn't really know exactly what my job is, but she's very pleased I sit on a panel with Zac. So I was chatting to this taxi driver about what I did, and I explained it, and I said, we've got to decarbonise the economy. And he just said to me, he goes, well, it's got to be cleaner, but not too expensive. And that's it, right? That's we call it greener, cheaper, that is the message, that we are decarbonising, but we are doing it absolutely at the lowest possible cost that we can to protect you. And if you're the poorest, that we are protecting you. That's what I think is a narrative that's going to work. Sadly, I just don't think the policy fits that. You can't make a convincing case on microgeneration solar panels on people's roofs at £300 a tonne of carbon that people go, oh yeah, I believe your greener, cheaper message or whatever. And I think that's kind of the problem we've got into. Can I just talk about George's point very quickly? Very quickly. In that I'm slightly more optimistic about politicians' ability and government's ability to bring people together and be a kind of message in this area. And that's why I think speeches are important and the conversation that politicians have are important. And exactly what the right form is, whether it's a big set-piece speech or it's kind of a local authority level working, that's still up for debate. But I think government does have a big role. It's not a very centre-right point of view, is it?
Everything in these conversations always come back to the centre, basically. It's true.
Just really quickly then on the point about energy bills, and obviously that's the everyday discourse, the everyday reality. There's no reason why energy bills shouldn't be as cheap as they possibly can be for everyone, but the reality of taking action on climate change isn't always going to be something that saves us money. It isn't, and I fear for the Green Deal for that reason, because it's phrased as a series of bribes essentially to get your home insulated, which is fine, but it doesn't ever engage with the underlying substantive issues of climate change. What's going to happen when the next policy comes in? Smart meters. Not everything's going to mean saving money. So if you never engage with the underlying reasons and it all collapses into a cost discussion, I think just making life harder for ourselves.
And the interesting sort of example there is the German experience of the energy vendor, or however you pronounce it, of seeing it as an investment. seeing it as we're going to have to upgrade somehow, we might as well do it in a clean fashion. We need to invest. And there really isn't much of an alternative path at the same time as trying to do it on the lowest cost path that is available. Yeah, hopefully. Yeah, and it has that political consensus, and as a result, investment is flowing, and the country is moving forward very, very fast with the decarbonisation agenda. That would be useless, wouldn't it? I'm going to wrap it up there. We've only overrun by 5 minutes. I didn't have to be rude to anyone, so thank you, everybody, for their timely questions. And most of all, of course, thank you to our panel for their thoughts today.